To be alive is to be involved. It's to be in relationship. And to be in relationship is to be obligated, to have claims made on your life. Life itself, just the act of being alive, makes a claim on us. It demands that we sleep and breathe and eat. And being alive in relationship also makes claims on us. Our families, our friends, our loved ones, our bosses. Things as simple as someone saying to you, "Oh, hey, look at that cute little bird over there." Or, "Would you please pass the salsa?" Things as big as, "I need you to look after my loved one for 2 months because they're ill." Or devote your time, your emotional energy to a task. One of the ways that we try to negotiate this tension and to figure out how we respond is we play what I call the worthiness game. We start ranking things and evaluating them and judging them and trying to decide, okay, is this worthy of a response? Is this person worthy of responding to? But that is not the way of Jesus. What Jesus offers and tells us to seek is not worthiness, but a sense of wholeness. A wholeness in ourselves, in our community, and with God. So today, Jesus offers a very instructive parable. It is the story of a father and 2 sons, although the word in Greek actually means child, so it could be a son and a daughter or 2 daughters, 2 non-binary people. And the first says no when the father asks, "Hey, go work in the field." The first child says no, but then later comes around and actually does go to the vineyard. And then the second child says, "Yeah, absolutely, I got you. I'm all about that working in the vineyard," but doesn't actually go in the end. And when Jesus shares this parable, he's talking to the Pharisees and the chief priests. He's in the temple and he's talking to team worthiness, right? These guys are all about figuring out who's worthy and who's not. The Pharisees are about who's worthy because they uphold the law. The Sadducees and the chief priests are all about who's worthy because they are the guardians of the temple power. And the word that Jesus uses here, the word that comes into question, is authority. By what authority are you doing these things? And it means power in Greek, but I think worthiness is a good way of understanding it because what they're asking is what makes you worthy of even listening to? What makes you worth all of this trouble? I mean, you rode into Jerusalem on a donkey and then you proceeded to flip over a bunch of tables and you're messing everything up. What makes you worthy of causing all of this fuss? They want to draw some lines and understand, okay, we know who's worthy, we know who's pure, we know who's impure. But Jesus is pushing back on that whole notion. He doesn't respond by justifying his worthiness. He doesn't point to his legacy, his heritage, his lifestyle. Instead, he questions their assumptions. He starts chipping away at the entire obsession with worthiness. He plants seeds of doubt. And there is no one that team worthiness dislikes more, despises more, than the sex workers and the tax collectors. The tax collectors were collaborators. They raised taxes for the hated Roman Empire, and they often skimmed a little bit off the top, too, at the expense of their fellow Jews. But Jesus says, these folks you despise, that you consider unworthy, they're the ones who are signing up for God's team. They're the ones who are out in the field with me helping to plant a vineyard, to grow something new and beautiful, to cultivate community. And so Jesus doesn't just answer with his own credentials. He starts rebutting this whole notion of worthiness. He starts making them ask what it means to be worthy, or why they think they're the ones who are worth so much. Jesus doesn't just think that the point of life is to figure out who is worthy and who is not worthy, and then be part of the worthy crew, right? That's what we go through very often in life. And whether we use the term worthy or not, successful, right? Respectable. To figure out who's in that group, who's not, and to join the good group. Jesus just rejects that whole mentality. And instead he offers wholeness. What he's seeking to bring and to instill is a sense of deep, deep groundedness, interconnection, wholeness within each person, wholeness between people, wholeness with and in God. And when we read this parable in light of wholeness, we get maybe a different tenor, a different picture than when we're thinking in terms of worthiness. So take the Father, for example. We tend to look at this in the lens of worthiness and obedience, and we say, okay, this is a father who's going to his children and telling them, go out, work in the field, do all this grueling, hard manual labor. I'm going to be in the house watching the game. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if the father is saying, I'm going out into the field to grow something more beautiful, and you're invited? What if instead of a matter of obedience, what we're talking about is an invitation to grace, an invitation to participate in the life of grace, to participate in a sense of wholeness that is emerging like a bud, like a flower? And looking through this lens, well, what can we understand about each of these children? The second child is the one who says, sure thing, I'm all about working, no problem, and then just doesn't go. And the worthiness mentality says, this child was disobedient. But that's how we think, not how Jesus thinks. Maybe we can consider that that this child wants to participate, but there's something blocking him or her. And we can look at this child and we can empathize because we know what it's like to have other demands on our lives. Maybe this child is someone who doesn't have enough time but has trouble saying no. Do you know anyone like that? Has trouble saying no when someone asks them a favor, even if it means that they can't follow through. Maybe this child is someone just like us who commits too much, runs out of time, runs themselves ragged. Maybe it's someone who just gets distracted easily and, sort of meant to go work in the field, but then watched one Netflix show and then started binging all of Tiger King, and before you know it, it's too late and you're in a parable. And when we look at it in this lens, well, there's different ways to respond. Maybe we can understand ourselves in these shoes and we can ask ourselves, what do we need to do to remove some of the things that keep us from responding to God's invitation? How do we find the courage to say no to things so that when God calls us to something that feels real, that feels whole, we're actually able to be there? How do we commit to time for prayer? Or say, you know what, I'm going to go for a walk 3 times a week because that's where I clear my head and find grace. What if this child desperately wanted to go but was divided and torn up inside between what the child desperately wants? It's a fairly common tale if you know anything about addiction. You want to do something, but you don't do the thing you want, as Paul says in Romans. You do the thing you hate. What if this child, it has an addiction of some sort? In our liberation group, we're looking at this notion of addiction and spirituality, and what we discover is it's not just about addiction to alcohol or a substance. We might all be addicted to some things. Maybe we're addicted to food. Maybe we're addicted to being liked, addicted to being right. And what if the desire to fulfill that addiction holds us back from answering this invitation to grace? What if it's tearing us apart and we need the wholeness that Jesus provides? I mean, if that's the situation, then what we're talking about first and foremost is just admitting our addictions and practicing self-care. We look at this not as simple obedience, but how can I be the person I want to be so that when God calls me, I am ready? And what about this first child? This is the first child who's like, nope, I'm not having any of that. I'm not interested, not playing that game. And then somehow changes their mind. Maybe we can see ourselves here as well. The worthiness game says that this is the good kid, right? This is the good kid because it's the obedient kid. Maybe you were raised in a household like that. Maybe you were raised in a church like that, where being good simply meant just following all of the rules and being obedient. But we have to ask ourselves, with wholeness on our mind, what would make this child say one thing and do another? I mean, maybe the child has a bad habit, and that habit's laziness or some other task that always distracts its attention. Maybe the child finally broke this bad habit. So the kid said no and then broke a bad habit and went out and did what they always wanted to do anyway. I mean, how many habits do we have that lock us into patterns of thinking and steal a bit of freedom from our everyday lives? Gretchen Robbins says, habits are the invisible architecture of daily life. And if we change our habits, we change our lives. So perhaps we can start small if we're trying to find a new habit. We can set a timer on our phones for 5 minutes and try it out. Say that we're only going to do it one time each week instead of insisting that we do it 7 days a week and not following through. Maybe we can reward ourselves with a sweet, a cookie, or some ice cream when we do the things that we want to be doing, when we develop new habits. I also hear this child say, I will not, and then go forth and actually follow through. And I think of those people who just sort of become overcome by negativity. Do you know anyone like that? Their first response to the world is sort of just always no. And it's often a protective mechanism. It's as soon as something changes, as soon as something new approaches, they just shroom like a turtle sinking into their shell. And their first response is no, 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 no. And then maybe they can work their way out of that shell. But what if our first response was yes? What if every time we encountered newness, we started with excitement? We started with hopefulness. We started by looking at this and saying, these are the possibilities that God is exploding into our lives. And from that starting point of yes, we can discern what is right for us, what we can commit to, what is safe for us. But we've started with the presumption that it is a good world and God is on our side. So maybe this child needed to overcome a habit of negativity. Or maybe this kid was just at the end of their rope. Maybe we're talking about a kid that is tired and overwhelmed. I mean, we've been 6 months in quarantine. 2020 has been quite a year. We can understand this sense of just being tapped out of energy, right? And maybe when the kid said, I will not, it was because they were done. They just couldn't. But then they found some new source of energy, some new source of vibrance and life. They tapped into a flowing river. I think this is what Paul's talking about in the Philippians reading today when Paul says, for it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for God's good pleasure. We can take small moments in prayer. And we can realize that God is there with us, bringing us wholeness and new energy. We can come together in worship each Sunday and find comfort in community and have other people to lift us up when we run out of energy, and recognize that it is God working through them to lift us up. We can open our scriptures and see it not as a rule book, but as the story of people overcoming and emerging from terrible adversity and saying, I am part of this story. I can do the same thing. And so what are we left with here? I think it's possible that we have two children who are stuck in the worthiness game. Their reasons, and there are many, might all fall back on some fundamental truth that they think they know about their lives. It's possible that the first child just didn't feel worthy. That the first child said, yes, I'll do that, and then thought about it and said, I am not the right fit for God's plan. I don't belong in that. I'm unworthy of participating in what God is doing. And maybe the second child looked at it and said, well, participating in the life of God, that's not terribly glamorous. Often it looks like losing. Often it looks like service instead of fame and fortune. And maybe I don't want to be part of that because I want to be worthy. So these two children are wrapped up in this game. And the only way out of that is this presence of God. And that's what Paul is saying when he says, let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus Christ. Though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. Jesus did not just come to draw new lines around who is unworthy and who is worthy. Jesus came to just break that whole system altogether, just toss it out the window. We're replacing worthiness with wholeness. Wholeness. That odd feeling that the pieces inside of you all fit and that the missing pieces have been filled. That feeling that we are one in community together and still individuals, that we can give and love without worrying. That feeling that we are deeply in the presence of God, that we are partnering with God and not fearing God's punishment. Wholeness doesn't come from seeking it. The Father invited these two children, not from striving after it. Wholeness, it doesn't say you have to be worthy and then God will invite you. That's doing the whole story backwards. Grace comes first. You don't have to be working in the field already. Grace is inviting you to participate in the life of God. And that's the message of the cross. The cross looked exactly like losing. It was shameful. It was the worst possible death. The cross was unworthy of a Messiah, let alone a God. And yet, through it, paradoxically, we affirm that God brought wholeness. That wholeness looked like losing. It didn't look like winning. Wholeness is what God offers, what Jesus exemplifies, what we strive for every day. And it's not worthiness. It's not holiness. It's not hipness or fitness, fanciness or mightiness or impressiveness or success. It's wholeness that God offers you. And in worship, we hope to experience that wholeness together through prayer, through scripture, through silence, and through song.